Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar about NIPSCO's truly outrageous electric bills. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight. We are, of course, recording this webinar, and we will be sure to share the recording and the presentation slides as soon as we can after the webinar concludes. We are, of course, your Citizens Action Coalition, a nonprofit consumer and environmental advocacy organization. We were founded here in Indiana back in 1974 in response to the energy crisis. And that's a little bit before my time, but the conditions then were similar to what we're experiencing right now. Folks are having a hard time. We're having a hard time keeping up with rising costs across the board. So that's why in 1974, a group of churches, labor unions, and senior groups came together to found us with the whole goal of advocating for the little guy when it comes to energy issues. We are a statewide organization and we don't win every fight, but we have managed to help save Hoosiers over $10 billion in excess utility charges. We really advocate for three main goals: fair and affordable utility bills, a cleaner, healthier environment, and a stronger democracy here in Indiana as well. We advocate for those goals through three main ways. One is, of course, by conducting research and educating and organizing the public. Because when you take on big companies, you need a lot of folks standing together to get stuff done. We also engage at the Indiana Statehouse with legislative advocacy. Big utility companies like NIPSCO and others do have lobbyists that engage at the State House. So we work hard to make sure that legislators also hear how proposed laws will impact the people of the state. And we also do so much work in the regulatory arena when utilities file to raise electric bills or other utility cases. We've got a wonderful team and a lawyer that works hard to make sure that the people are being represented in those cases as well. We are so excited to have you all here tonight. I'm Kelly. I'm joined by two of my wonderful colleagues, our Executive Director, Kerwin Olson, and our Program Director, Ben Inskeep. Kerwin will be jumping on in just a sec to provide some important background information and to walk us through how state legislation has led to incredibly high bills that we're seeing all across the state, but especially up in NIPSCO land. Then Ben, our program director, will provide a regulatory update. He'll walk through some cases at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission that have led to high bills. Then I'll come back and talk a little bit about organizing, and we'll wrap up with a question and answer session. So you should see a Q&A feature through Zoom. As questions come to you throughout the webinar, please feel free to type in those questions, but we will wait to respond to most of them to the very end of the webinar. And with that, I will pass it to Kerwin.
Oh, great. Thank you, Kelly. Hi, everybody. Kerwin Olson. So glad to see everybody. Yeah, why are we here tonight? Well, I think that probably goes without saying, but we've seen a significant increase in not just electric bills, but also gas and water and wastewater bills as well. Folks are struggling to get by. We've got what most folks are calling an affordability crisis, if you will. And when it comes to utility services, we're talking about essential human services that are necessary for folks to participate in society in a meaningful way. And, we believe strongly, our mission statement says it, that we believe all Hoosiers should have access to affordable, essential human services. Just want to give some background on the various roles of various government agencies, if you will, in the setting of utility rates and the policy that guides that. We, of course, have the Indiana General Assembly. Can't lose sight of the fact that the IURC, the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, as well as the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, created by statute, created by law, as you well know. General Assembly passes the laws that govern the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission and energy policy in general. They also have a say in the funding that supports those agencies. And both agencies right now are unfortunately short-staffed with some budget shortfalls, and CAC always advocates for robust funding for those agencies because we need advocates and we need regulators to have the tools and the resources they need to do their jobs. But make no doubt about it, 150 elected state senators and state representatives play a significant role in terms of energy policy in our state, but also the setting of utility rates. Then we have, of course, the regulators themselves, the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, commonly referred to as the IURC, and getting back to the connection between the IURC and the General Assembly. The IURC frequently goes out of their way to say that they are a creature of statute, if you will, empowered and emboldened only with the authority granted them by the General Assembly. There's a lot of truth to that, which we'll be talking about here in a second, but they also are empowered as the only agency in the state, the only body in the state that can govern utility rates and do have authority to make decisions that would benefit ratepayers in the long run. We created the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission and other state commissions across the country. Their primary function, primary role, if you will, is a surrogate to competition. These are investor-owned monopolies with a captive rate base, if you will. Natural monopolies, I suppose, is what folks like to call them. But in exchange of that privilege of being a monopoly with a captive rate base, if you will, a exclusive service territory, the exchange for that, the contract for that, is that you will be regulated. So we created these bodies to act as that surrogate, the competition in the absence thereof, if you will. So we need to ensure that the regulators have the authority, the flexibility to do what they need and do their job. They set utility rates. They oversee the utilities. The Consumer Affairs Division, otherwise known as the CAD, addresses consumer complaints. And we've seen an uptick in complaints recently at the Consumer Affairs Division. And we encourage folks to reach out to the IURC and file a complaint to get your concerns addressed, because it's important that the stories, they hear your stories, they hear your challenges. They hear from advocates like us all the time, but they can dismiss us sometimes as sort of anecdotal. They need to hear from ratepayers and everyday folks and the struggles that they're experiencing to help drive the kind of change that we need to see. And then we also have a state consumer advocate, an advocate for the public, if you will, known as the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor. They're the statutory advocate for the public before the Regulatory Commission and before certain federal agencies as well when needed. They don't speak just for residential customers. They have an obligation, if you will, to examine and do what they can for all rate classes, including residential, commercial, industrial, and others. But they are appointed. The consumer advocate is appointed and serves at the will and the pleasure of the governor. And the 5 commissioners that serve on the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission are also appointed by the governor and serve at the will and the pleasure of the governor. And I always have to mention, the last time we looked into it, Indiana is one of only 4 states in the entire country where those that regulate the investor-owned monopoly utilities are either A, not directly elected by the public, as is the case in about 14 states, or they go through a confirmation process before one or both chambers of the legislative body to get an up or down vote from legislators. We're one of 4 states where they appointed and serve at the will and the pleasure of the governor, really with little to no input from the public or the legislature. And that's been a core issue for CAC for a number of years. And so when folks ask, what can we do? What can we do? We've got to look at the systemic problems within the regulation in the state of Indiana. And that's one of those problems, is we are one of a fraction of the states where there's no oversight, either from voters or from the legislative body. Now let's talk a little bit about our friends at the Indiana General Assembly and the anti-consumer pro-utility laws that they've been passing for a very, very long time. Really, this trend, this parade of pro-utility laws, for the most part, really started in earnest back in 2011 with what was then Senate Enrolled Act 251, or the Federal Mandate Bill. that is commonly called, but it's continued since then. We've seen year after year after year of bills that authorize what are commonly called trackers or adjustable riding mechanisms that show up on your bill, those fees, those riders that are above and beyond base rates that are set in rate cases. They have what's known as QWIP, as you see on the slide, construction work in progress for environmental compliance projects at power plants, for the construction of new power plants. And what that means is that means ratepayers are paying for investments in power plants before those power plants are providing any service to the public. Basically, prepaying for something, prepaying for your house while your house is being built, if you will, while you're still paying for everything else. And Citizens Action Coalition and consumer advocates really struggle with trackers because it sort of redefines the relationship, if you will, between a ratepayer and a utility company. It's pretty. The idea is that utility companies and their voluntary investors, if you will, fund the day-to-day operations of the utility companies, and ratepayers then pay for service. Well, these trackers, which include QWIP, and which of course include that TDSIC statute, first passed back in 2013, that stands for Transmission, Distribution, Storage, and Improvement Charge. That's the law NIPSCO has been using for substantial investments in their electric grid and for substantial investments in their natural gas pipeline network. They have that available to them for both natural gas service and electric service. And what that means is that when they're planning these projects, when they're beginning to construct these projects and procure the equipment, ratepayers start paying for those things, effectively turning a ratepayer into an involuntary financier, if you will, of the utility company. What makes it even more egregious is utilities earn, their on average 10% rate of return on those trackers, even though they could finance these investments in the private market for a much lower interest rate. Ratepayers are effectively giving utility companies interest-free loans with 10% profit tacked onto it. And so we've seen year after year after year these bills that force and mandate ratepayers to pay for this stuff. What makes it worse is, getting back to the commission, these bills include so many shall provisions where the commission shall approve, the commission shall approve. And we talked about ensuring that regulators have the tools and the flexibility and the discretion to do their job. Those types of laws reduce the flexibility, the discretion, the authority of the commission to act as that surrogate to competition and to equally protect the interest of ratepayers with the interest of the utilities. Really undermines the regulatory process. In addition to speeding up timelines, if you will, in cases when utilities are seeking approval for big investments, really tight timelines for some of these cases, 60 days, 90 days, which makes it really, really challenging for stakeholders before the commission, for the OUCC to really do their job, dig into these filings and uncover precisely what the utilities are seeking. Utilities have months, if not years, to prepare their cases, and then they file at the commission. They expect the public to be able to respond in 60, 90 days to thousands and thousands of pages of testimony and work papers. Makes it really hard. In addition to favorable regulatory treatment, the Indiana General Assembly has, eroded choices of consumers and the only other competition that the utilities have. What's the other competition the utilities have? Energy efficiency. Reducing the amount of energy that you use is the most powerful tool, if you will, to control your energy bill. But the General Assembly canceled the wonderful Energizing Indiana program that was leading to a trend of reduced monthly bills and reduced demand on the grid. They got rid of that. They banned net metering for self-generation, a powerful tool to reduce energy bills, to mitigate climate change, to improve quality of life, rooftop solar, wind on farmlands. They got rid of net metering, replaced it with a much less favorable financial mechanism, if you will, that makes it much more financially difficult and less favorable to install solar at your home by reducing the compensation that you receive for putting excess energy onto the grid. And they ended competition in transmission projects. Transmission is playing a huge role in driving up electric bills across the country. And what they did was they gave the utilities what's called ROFR, or right of first refusal, meaning transmission projects within that utility service territory. That utility had the right to do that project rather than putting that out to a competitive bid process to allow third parties to come in and bid those projects. And we've seen across the country third-party transmission projects are far cheaper than the monopoly utility running those transmission projects through their system. And I guess I skipped ahead, but weakening IURC oversight was really problematic with all these bills, and I've already sort of covered that. But really, the faster procedure and schedule timelines, I can't stress what a difficulty that is for stakeholders before the commission when you compress the timeline that we have to review cases, do discovery, file our testimony and whatnot. So really, the General Assembly has played a tremendous role, we believe, in what we're seeing in this affordability crisis today. And these laws, after year after year after year, we've seen the impacts of these just pancake one on top of the other, which Ben will talk about here in a bit. And then lastly, I want to talk about 2026 at the Indiana General Assembly. I can tell you, this is my 21st session down at the Indiana General Assembly, and the tone, the air, the atmosphere, the vibe is very different. I know a lot of folks are dissatisfied with the outcome, felt they could have and should have done more, and there's truth to that. But I can tell you that everybody down there at the Indiana Statehouse are hearing what's going on outside the building and are finally being responsive. The vibe was very, very different this session. And I'm sort of optimistic about the direction that the conversation is going. We saw a significant bill passed, House Bill 1002, authored by Representative Alana Shankweiler from Noblesville. I have nothing but good things to say about Representative Shankweiler shepherding that bill through the process almost unanimously. There were some very key provisions passed in that bill that Citizens Action Coalition has been working on for decades, trying to get passed. And this year we saw some of those measures finally be realized and become law. There's now finally a mandate that utility companies provide low-income assistance programs to low-income ratepayers. We've had those programs for natural gas for almost 2 decades now. The Universal Service Fund for gas ratepayers, we've worked hard to try to get some movement on low-income assistance programs, and finally this year got that across the finish line. Additionally, in that bill, there's some confusion I see and some discussions about that. That program, that bill requires that the utilities shareholders pay to fund those programs. The funding for that program is mandated by statute, by that law, to come from the revenues that the utility companies collect, not an additional tracker or a charge on customers. Furthermore, we've had a winter disconnection moratorium in place for decades that protects low-income households from disconnection during the coldest months of the year. CAC and others have been working for a number of years to try to get something similar for summertime, for extreme heat. And that was part of that bill. An extreme heat disconnection moratorium is now in place with the governor's signature on that bill. So that is a very positive development as well. And then we've got the levelized billing, formerly known as budget billing, which, the bill is introduced, would have mandated all ratepayers go on levelized billing. That was changed to only customers eligible to receive LIHEAP will be moved to levelized billing by July 1st. But those households do have the ability to opt out of that program. So while those households will be automatically shifted to levelized billing if they don't opt out, they can opt out at any time at no penalty. Quarterly utility reporting was in that bill. That's been a very, very important issue. Why is that important? It's very important to understand, can customers afford their bills? How many folks are you disconnecting? How many disconnection notices have you sent out? How many customers are in arrears past 60 days, past 90 days? They are now mandated to report that information on a quarterly basis to the OUCC. So that is a positive thing that came out of that bill. And then the last item in the bill is the shift to performance-based rate making and multi-year rate plans. I will say we're generally neutral on the idea of performance-based rate making because the devil is in the details and what that is really going to look like. I can tell you that the PBR, performance-based rating in this bill, is a very, very modest approach. Utilities will now have to file reports around affordability based on consumer price index and another report on reliability, basically metrics around duration of outages, how long it takes to restore service. So that's a good thing, finally holding the utilities accountable with some reporting on that stuff. And if they don't hit their metrics, The commission has the ability to fine them a small, modest fine. If they do hit their metrics, the commission may reward a very small, modest incentive. So very, very modest. Won't even be really noticed on utility bills, but it's nice to see finally the utilities being held accountable. And we're moving to 3-year, multi-year rate plans where the utilities will now, we're shifting from the traditional base rate cases as we've known it to these multi-year rate plans, 3-year rate plans. And we'll see how that goes. NIPSCO won't be filing their first multi-year rate plan until later in 2028. So it's a very modest approach, if you will, to PBR, and why I was optimistic sort of about. It's a recognition. Sorry, can you hear me? My computer is freaking out.
Yep, you're back on,
Okay.
Kerwin.
All right. Sorry about that. My screen went dark for a second. It's a recognition that what we're doing today, what we've been doing, just isn't working. So it's time to take a different approach. We'll see how this goes in practice. I say we're cautiously optimistic. It's going to be a while before this stuff gets put into place, but we'll see how it goes. And we like the idea of trying something new, trying something different, because as we've seen today, when those bills hit our mailbox or our email inbox on a monthly basis, they're getting out of control. Lots of issues were not addressed in that bill that could have been addressed. We'll likely continue to see rates go up in the near term, but we do have a new commission, if you will. We do have some new legislation and a different atmosphere here in Indianapolis with respect to utility bills. So we're cautiously optimistic about where the conversation is going, understanding folks are still struggling today, folks are still frustrated today, but you're being heard. IURC's got their upcoming investigation into utilities that may lead to something. Chairman Zay is going to come out into the communities to meet with folks. So it's sort of we'll see where this goes. Again, cautiously optimistic. And with that, Kelly, I will say farewell and turn it over to Ben to talk about the meat and bones here and why we're here.
Good evening, folks. I'm Ben Inskeep. I'm Program Director at CAC. I'm going to give you a regulatory update, talk a little bit about our bills and rates. At a high level, we're going to be talking both about electric and natural gas utility rates. So keep in mind, you could be just an electric customer of NIPSCO or just a gas customer, or maybe you're a customer of both gas and electric. We're going to be talking about both here tonight, but make sure you don't confuse the two, and I'll do my best to clearly describe both of them. For both of these, we're seeing a concern about, as Kerwin mentioned, the pancaking of costs, where you're paying for multiple things at the same time, and they're stacking up on top of each other, making them unaffordable. We'll dive into the details here shortly. At a high level, also, NIPSCO has been pursuing a regulatory strategy that, in our opinion, is also helping to facilitate this unaffordability by filing frequent rate cases, 3 of them in the last 6 years, using many different trackers. I think at least 7 now they're using and applying to bills that add surcharges in between rate cases that make your bill less affordable. They're cutting sweetheart deals, and we're going to talk about that more shortly with industrial customers. And then we also have the fact that Blackstone, a private equity group, has purchased 19.9% of NIPSCO. And so there's this pressure from private equity when they purchase a public utility to squeeze more revenue from the ratepayers. And we're seeing some of that happen today. So let's talk about the details now. First, with the electric side. This chart is showing you how a bill for 1,000 kilowatt hours of monthly usage has changed across time. 1,000 kilowatt hours of usage is a bit above average for NIPSCO, which is closer to 700 on average. But 1,000 is used often in our utility space here in Indiana to do apples to apples comparisons across utilities. As you can see from this chart here, NIPSCO's rates steadily increased over time, but it wasn't until the past couple years that they've really soared out of control. Just in the past 2 years, from 2023 to 2025, we saw a bill increase by $83 a month for 1,000 kilowatt hours of usage. That's a 49% increase. Customers can't adopt that quickly to these sudden rate increases, and that's what we mean when we say there's rate shock. Folks are struggling to keep up when bills are going up so fast with so few resources to prevent an affordability crisis. NIPSCO now has the highest bills in the state, about tied with CenterPoint for that dubious distinction. Let's break down what goes into your bill, starting with the base rate charges that are approved or set in a utilities base rate case. So first you have your fixed monthly customer charge of $14. That doesn't change based on your usage. You're going to pay that every month as long as you're a NIPSCO customer. Then the biggest portion of your bill is going to be in that base rate energy charge. That's where a lot of the different types of costs of NIPSCO service come into play. The power plants, the transmission lines, the distribution lines, all of the equipment, all of the administrative and general costs. All these other costs are typically going to be rolled into these energy charges that vary on a per kilowatt hour basis. So the more you use, the higher your energy charge component of your bill will be. Now let's look at the tracker part. As Kerwin mentioned, the General Assembly has been passing all sorts of laws over the past 15 years that gives utilities the ability to add these surcharges on top of our bills. And NIPSCO has at least 7 in place right now, shown here. Let's look at just the first one, the fuel cost tracker, as an example. The fuel cost tracker is meant to help true up costs of the fuel that NIPSCO buys, like coal or natural gas, that they then combust in a power plant to generate electricity. Now, there's a base component of the fuel cost built into that energy charge that was previously shown. But when NIPSCO underestimates the cost of fuel and has to go purchase more expensive fuel, it's allowed to pass on those costs to customers on a dollar for dollar basis. But also, if the fuel costs turn out to be less expensive than they thought, NIPSCO can credit you for that difference. And that's what we're seeing on the current rates currently in effect for NIPSCO. You see that $3.99 in red, that's a credit that NIPSCO is flowing back to customers because the cost of fuel was less expensive than they were estimating it to be. And then let's finally look at the final component of the bill, sales tax. This is controlled by the General Assembly, and you and I are all paying 7% on our utility bills. But not every customer does. For example, data centers don't have to pay a sales tax on their bills, and that's a problem. But before we dive into that, let's look at the whole picture altogether. Putting all these charges together, we now see kind of where all the charges are. We see the base rates do make up the largest component of the bill. But over time, between the time of NIPSCO's rates are implemented and the time they file their next rate case, the tracker mechanisms are going to grow larger, at least for some of them. Things like the transmission and distribution TDSIC charge is something that NIPSCO is going to continue to make investments in and continue to increase that amount to make to recover the costs of those investments. Let's move on to the next issue. Let's talk a little bit about the natural gas bills. Natural gas bills have also seen a significant spike recently. We see a little bit more variability for natural gas customers. Specifically, if you look at this chart, it's not just a general increasing over time, but there was a large spike in 2022 and 2023, and that was due to fuel costs having a significant spike in those years, brought on by things like Russia invading Ukraine and creating a lot of global instability in fuel cost prices. Fuel costs came down a bit in 2024, and then things went right back to the trajectory of increasing over time. We've seen bills increase by about $36 or 42% for 100 therms of usage. And a therm is just a natural gas unit of measurement. Just like we have kilowatt hours for electricity, a therm is the unit we use to measure how much natural gas you're using in a monthly period. Altogether, what this has done is meant NIPSCO's affordability ranking has declined over time. Believe it or not, NIPSCO was actually the most affordable natural gas bills back in January of 2018. But since that time, they have steadily fallen in the rankings. Now they're in the middle of the pack at number 8 out of 19 as a result of this large increase the past few years. Let's look at a breakdown of a natural gas bill now. This is that similar chart to what I showed for the electric customers, now breaking down all the components of your natural gas bill. You have your base rates, including that fixed customer charge. You have that distribution or delivery charge that has been causing a lot of NIPSCO customers a lot of problems recently because it's been so darn expensive. That distribution charge is paying for things like the natural gas pipelines that are being used to deliver the natural gas that NIPSCO buys and deliver it all the way to your household. Now, the cost of that natural gas is built into that next charge you see, the gas supply commodity charge. Natural gas is a very volatile fuel in terms of the price that we pay for it. Sometimes it can be cheap, sometimes it can be really expensive, other times it's in between. And so this has a very yo-yoing effect on our gas bills, where some years they can be more affordable, other years they can get extremely expensive based on geopolitical events and other factors in the market. There's also a number of other tracker charges that you see here, including a T-to-SIC tracker. Just like with the electric side, the T-to-SIC tracker on the gas side is allowing NIPSCO to spend a lot of money on natural gas pipelines and other types of improvements to their system and pass those costs on quickly onto your bill. And just like with an electric bill, we're paying sales tax on gas bills as well. Now, one thing I wanted to share with you all is that we recently learned that NIPSCO has discovered that it has been that its meters, at least some of its meters, have been incorrectly recording usage for customers. NIPSCO has found that for about 3,500 customers, they have been getting billed about double the actual usage, resulting in much higher bills than they should have been paying. Now, I want to let folks know that NIPSCO learned about this way back in October 24, but they didn't inform our utility regulators until about a year later in September of 2025. And we didn't learn about it until just this week when NIPSCO finally filed testimony in front of the commission explaining what happened. NIPSCO explained what happened as they were rolling out their AMI smart meter component, which is just a component they're going to add to your existing gas meter if they haven't already. That's going to allow them to read that meter usage on a much more granular basis and do so remotely. So in other words, there's not going to need to be a meter reader that comes around to check your meter or a truck roll to come by to collect that information, but rather NIPSCO will be able to get that data automatically. And these AMI components allowed NIPSCO to discover that a subset of their natural gas meters, they say less than 1%, are creating this error, but it's still resulting in thousands of customers having been overbilled for their natural gas service, potentially for many years. NIPSCO doesn't know when the problem started or what caused it, but it does know that these customers were essentially charged double. NIPSCO is only proposing to refund 1 year of overcharges for these customers that were impacted. And Citizens Action Coalition has intervened in the case, and we'll be filing our testimony and recommendations in May and doing our best to stand up for residential customers who have been overcharged and are frustrated by this experience with NIPSCO. Let's hit on a couple more issues about what's affecting our bill. And I want to get into the issue of cost allocation by a quick analogy to a pizza party you might be having. Let's say you and 3 friends get together and order a pizza. Everyone's hungry. You want to split the pizza 4 ways. Each going to have a fourth of the pizza. Each of you is going to pay 1/4 of the cost, right? That makes sense. But let's say one of your friends leaves early before the pizza actually gets delivered. Now what do? You have leftover pizza, but now there's only 3 of you to split the bill. So each of you are paying more, but you didn't get any hungrier. Well, how does this translate to our electric and gas rates? Well, it's instead of a pizza party, we're talking about NIPSCO purchasing power plants and other infrastructure to serve customers. Just like with you splitting the cost between your friends for a pizza, NIPSCO is splitting the cost of its power plants between different types of customers. Their industrial customers, their commercial customers, and the residential customers. Now, back before 2020, big industrial customers were paying the biggest share of these power plant costs to NIPSCO. But then in 2019, they cut a sweetheart deal with NIPSCO that was approved by our commission that allowed these very big industrial customers to purchase electricity on the wholesale power market and from other suppliers instead of getting their power from NIPSCO. What did that do to all the power plants that NIPSCO had built and spent a lot of money on to construct to serve these customers? Well, just like your friend leaving early before the pizza gets there, the big industrial customers leaving early before paying their fair share of these power plant costs meant that NIPSCO had all this extra capacity, all this extra power plants that fewer customers were paying for. And as a result, it led to $67 million to $87 million in costs per year being shifted onto commercial and residential customers from these very large industrial customers like US Steel or Cleveland Cliffs or BP, these very large industrial customers essentially essentially forced other customers to pick up the tab for their bill. That's part of this affordability story and why our residential rates in NIPSCO's service territory have gotten so darn high. Now, I do want to briefly mention data centers because it is a very important issue that's impacting a lot of Hoosier communities and creating a lot of anxieties. I want to emphasize that a lot of the bill impacts that we're facing today as for NIPSCO customers are not going to have been driven by data centers yet. These are from the other factors we've talked about. Now, data centers are going to cause our utilities to make a lot of investments going forward in order to serve these extraordinarily large energy guzzling facilities. So there certainly could be significant bill impacts in the future that we need to be carefully evaluating and making sure these big customers are paying their fair share. So what is NIPSCO doing about this issue? Well, I wanted to make sure folks are aware that NIPSCO has created a separate company called GenCo that is going to be owning the power plants that are going to be built to serve data center customers. In other words, data centers aren't going to be paying for NIPSCO's other generating resources, and you are not going to be paying for the resources built to serve data centers. Now, does that mean we don't have anything to worry about with data centers? No, it doesn't. In fact, we're involved in a case right now where NIPSCO has entered into a sweetheart deal with Amazon for Amazon to build out massive data centers in Northwest Indiana. NIPSCO is selling this as a great deal for customers because it's going to take some of the money that it's getting from Amazon and credit it back to ratepayers in an amount it's estimating is going to be about $1 billion over 15 years, which sounds great until you realize that NIPSCO hasn't actually calculated what the costs are going to be to the system imposed by these customers. These large data centers are going to put wear and tear on our transmission system, and we need to make sure they're paying their fair share of transmission costs. So according to our analysis, these data center, Amazon should be paying much higher contributions towards this fixed transmission system that you have paid for over time by being a NIPSCO ratepayer. It's really important that these large customers coming in are contributing to the upkeep of that system and are helping pay you back for the investments that you have helped contribute to as being a NIPSCO customer for many years. And it's all the more so important because we have more data centers on the way. Folks like Google, Microsoft, and DX Hammond are planning new facilities or expansions in the near future. So we'll continue to be on guard and making sure ratepayers aren't picking up the tab for these large customers. Now, to summarize, why are NIPSCO bills so high? We've talked about the legislative background that has led to higher bills. We've talked about things like the pancaking of rates, where we're seeing things like really expensive coal plants staying open. NIPSCO added really expensive pollution control equipment on top of them and then retired them early often. There's major coal ash cleanup going on at NIPSCO coal plants because they essentially were just dumping coal ash on site and unlined coal ash pits in a very unsafe manner. And now, due to federal regulations, they're being forced to clean up these messes that are leaking toxic constituents into our waterways. But they're making residential customers, commercial customers, other NIPSCO customers foot the bill for these cleanup costs. Then you get into the issue of NIPSCO has coal plants that have retired that are still part of our bills. They have expensive generation that is serving customers presently. And then, as Kerwin mentioned, they also have trackers that allow them to charge you for things like future power plants that are still under construction, but not providing you any energy yet or other benefit. So that pancaking of types of costs is adding up for customers. Then you layer on top of that all of those grid and pipeline expenditures. On the pipeline front, I want to highlight that our gas delivery charges have spiked in NIPSCO service territory due to a situation where for a long time, between 1988 and 2010, NIPSCO wasn't making very many investments in its natural gas pipeline system. It didn't file any rate cases during that period of time. Then it's gone on a bit of a spending binge since that time, thanks to the policies passed by the General Assembly. We saw that ramp up in the 2010s, And now in the 2020s, we're seeing that continue to accelerate to new heights. When it comes to sweetheart deals, we've already mentioned how industrial customers have been able to shift some of their costs onto residential customers. And that trend unfortunately continued with the rate case approved last year by the commission, where they approved a deal that allowed these large commercial and industrial customers to essentially raid tax credit benefits from solar and battery storage projects that should have gone to residential customers and instead pass those benefits on to these large commercial and industrial customers. So again, part of the reason why our rates are going up so much is residential customers aren't getting the benefits they're entitled to and are paying too large a share of the costs. Add to that the higher natural gas fuel costs and inflation, and then the billing errors that some customers are also experiencing, and you have a perfect storm for creating this affordability crisis. Let's walk through 10 solutions to how we can actually address the affordability crisis, starting with eliminating the residential sales tax. That's something that the General Assembly could immediately do to provide immediate bill relief. Take that 7% off our bills to make them more affordable. You've already done it for data centers. Let's do it for residential customers too. Number two, let's reduce those utility profit margins. They're essentially, have this base of customers that can't choose an alternative supplier. They have very little risk to their business. Why are we allowing them to pad their profits with exceptionally high profit margins? Let's cut those down, make them more affordable to customers today. Let's get rid of these bill trackers as well. As Kerwin mentioned, a lot of these bill trackers are just allowing NIPSCO to pass on costs to us in between rate cases instead of requiring NIPSCO to be a bit more diligent with their spending, a bit smarter with it, but, tighten their belt straps a little bit, tighten their belt, I should say, and make sure they're operating more efficiently. Let's get rid of all these bill trackers that are adding costs to our bills and are to the benefit of the utility, not to the ratepayer. There's also a bunch of different types of costs that we could cut out of the rates that we're paying. Things like reducing that executive compensation. Let's get rid of some of those bonuses for the millionaires that are running these companies. It's also outrageous that NIPSCO can charge you the costs of their lawyers and lobbyists and the regulatory experts who advocate for higher rates and pass those on to you, the customer, instead of their shareholders footing the bill. And also, NIPSCO has tried to sneak in the cost of private jets for their executives into rate cases in the past without disclosing it. And CAC, fortunately, learned about it by asking NIPSCO discovery questions, intervening in that case, and advocating against that and getting that proposal pulled. There's also a number of different ticky-tacky fees that NIPSCO can hit you with for a variety of reasons. Things like security deposits and late fees, things like transaction fees for using a credit card. These just add costs onto your bill, but they shouldn't, right? We can get rid of these fees. That would help affordability for a lot of folks. And please, let's make these big industrial customers and the data centers pay their fair share so that residential customers don't have to continue to shoulder the burden of these extraordinarily high grid spending costs and power plant costs. As NIPSCO is retiring its last few coal plants here and this year and the coming years, there's opportunities to reduce the costs of that remaining balance that ratepayers owe to them. Things like securitization can lower those interest rates. We've already seen one utility, CenterPoint, down in Southwest Indiana, do that and save their ratepayers lots of money when it came to one of their old coal plants that they retired. Why aren't we allowing this opportunity? Why aren't we allowing NIPSCO to take advantage of this opportunity to lower bills through that mechanism? We need the General Assembly to act there. Cleanup costs for coal ash, that should fall on shareholders, not on ratepayers. It was really irresponsible the way NIPSCO has been disposing of coal ash in an unsafe manner by just dumping it on site without any regard to the potential contamination that it could lead to. And lo and behold, we're seeing contamination by NIPSCO's own monitoring at these sites. Shareholders should foot the bill for the cleanup, not residential customers, not NIPSCO ratepayers. And we need to make sure customers have more options, things related to energy efficiency, community solar, rooftop solar. Folks need to have opportunity to save on their bills and not give all their money to NIPSCO. Last but not least, let's talk about private equity and let's get them out of the public utility business. These utilities are supposed to be in the public interest, serving us with needed essential service. Why is private equity that only cares about their investors buying our utilities and able to extract ever more from ratepayers in this state? I think we need a bit more oversight here. This is an opportunity for the General Assembly to weigh in. With that, let me say thank you and let me turn it over to Kelly to tell us how we can organize and fight back.
And thank you so much, Ben. Well, y'all, we've heard a lot of the problem and we've heard a number of solutions. Now we got to talk about getting there. One of the ways that, or one of the things that I think has hopefully become obvious throughout the course of this presentation is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Um, so there will always be another Indiana General Assembly legislative session, and there are frequent cases at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission that impact your bills. And we got to engage in each and every one of them for years to come so that things get better for people. CAC, we love to make it easy for you to make your voice heard and participate in those venues when you have the opportunity to do so. So please keep your eye on out for emails from us. You can also sign up for text messages from us, but we try not to overwhelm you with information, but we do want to give you a heads up with you can make your voice heard because we need all of us coming together to speak together. Getting organized is another important piece that you all are doing a great job of already. Want to give a big hat tip to folks all across Northern Indiana who are organizing with different Facebook groups. There's, of course, the NIPSCO Monopoly Madness that's got about 32,000 people in it. So kudos to the organizers and everyone who is helping to build momentum by spreading the word. We also see a lot of engagement on the data center issue across the whole state, but also Northern Indiana. Folks are really connecting, especially through Facebook groups, and that's really important for the fight ahead. Attending events is critical as well. We'll talk about a couple opportunities coming up, but when people show up in mass and have a coherent message with coherent solutions, that's what helps us make some progress in the policy realm, rather. And then, of course, taking action is essential too. We really need folks to be building relationships with elected officials because utility companies have relationships with elected officials, and we need the consumer's perspective to really be getting across right now. And of course, we've got pictures there, but y'all are turning out at protests and organizing different events. And that's really important to help elevate the issue and get even more folks involved in the push for change. We are having a town hall at the beginning of April, April 7th. It'll be in Maryville at the Dean and Barbara White Community Center. We'd love to have you join us. We'll be talking, sharing a little bit of information that we've shared tonight and having a robust question and answer session at the end where we can talk a little bit more in person. And we sure would love to meet you there as well. As Kerwin mentioned, the IURC has announced an investigative inquiry on energy affordability. So please do mark your calendars for March 24th. The meeting will be here in Indy, which you're welcome to attend, but live streaming is also an option and encouraged because they do pay attention to how many people are actively watching the proceeding. And that would save a lot of folks a big drive. In addition to that meeting on the 24th, the chairman of the IURC, Andy Zay, announced that he will be going across the state to listen to Hoosiers about what they're going through with high utility bills. So the dates and locations of that have not yet been announced, but when we learn of those dates and times, we'll be sure to let everybody know. Now, there's been a lot of discussion tonight about the state level authority for utility bills. And so our state legislators and our utility regulators have a big role to play in helping us address this affordability crisis that's impacting so many folks all across Indiana. but there is definitely still a lane for local elected officials to get involved, even though they're not quite as responsible in this scenario. And you can see a list of bullet points there. I'll say we're already seeing some municipalities across northern Indiana pass resolutions right now about addressing affordability in different ways. We'll just put a bug out there that the next time NIPSCO files a big old rate increase, it's helpful for municipalities to do it when there's an active case as well. Same thing goes with testifying at public field hearings. Um, when there's an active rate case, the more folks that can get engaged, the better. And when local elected officials speak up, that can be incredibly compelling and inspiring for their constituents as well to know they've got someone batting for them. Of course, local elected officials can also advocate for solutions using their position within the community. A lot of times, local elected officials have a nice following on social media channels or through email lists. And so it's great if those local folks can help to spread the word about engagement opportunities. And it is helpful when municipalities can engage in rate increases because it shows that there are more people and more entities that are working to kind of push back against, ever increasing electric and gas bills. We do want to give a shout out. NIPSCO's last electric rate increase they filed for in 2024, I believe. And school superintendents were really well organized, and they showed up and spoke really eloquently at the public field hearings about how hard they were working to lower their bills so that they could put more money in the classroom instead of going to NIPSCO. And the fact that when their NIPSCO bills go up, that's money away from students and teachers who desperately need it. That made a difference. And in the settlement that NIPSCO reached, they did have some concessions because of that organizing. So a big thank you on that front. And we do hope that when we see future rate increases, local officials are engaging as well. Now, we know that a lot of folks are struggling and making hard decisions that they shouldn't have to make about whether to buy food, pay their medicine, or pay their bills. So there are a few resources available for you. Of course, there are resources based on your income, like the Energy Assistance Program that we mentioned early on. NIPSCO has a couple other programs as well. So there's a QR code you can scan, or you can visit the website towards the bottom of the screen. There are also different energy efficiency programs available and options like levelized billing and payment arrangements that can last up to 12 months if you've accrued a really significant balance and need extra time to catch up. We'll also say that Indiana 211 is a very helpful resource because in addition to some of the programs that you can see here, different faith-based organizations and nonprofits will provide charitable utility assistance. And 211 can help connect you to people or to those groups in your area that provide that type of assistance. So another good resource in addition to what you see here as well. Now we'll dive into the Q&A in just 1 second. So I see a ton of questions. If we can't get to everyone tonight on the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up via email. But before we do want to make a quick plug for our website because we work really hard to make it a helpful resource for you in terms of compiling a lot of information and giving you opportunities to take action, contact public officials, and make your voice heard. The other piece that you can do on our website is contribute because we are a nonprofit and we're up against many large utility companies that have more resources than we do. So folks chipping in with what they can has kept us a vital force for 52 years, and we sincerely appreciate any and all help that you can give. And with that, I will stop sharing. And we will pivot into the Q&A portion. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And we'll share that. We'll hop here. Okay. Kerwin, we're going to start with you. Okay. We've got a great question. Did CAC argue that net metering lowered rates for customers who did not have rooftop solar? And did it have analysis behind this argument?
Um, well, yeah, I saw that question and thought I would address that live since I, dealt with net metering proposals at the State House and the Commission for a number of years, and would certainly also defer to Ben if he would want to complement my answer due to his background working on these issues as well. We certainly were and remain strong proponents of net metering. We certainly argued and continue to argue that distributed energy resources, particularly customer owned generation, reduces costs for utilities, reducing the need for power on the grid, infrastructure build out. The closer the energy is to the user, the cheaper and more efficient that energy is. That said, we also, believe that once net metering would reach a certain point of penetration, whether that was 5%, 6%, 7%, I believe the National Association of Regulators passed some sort of resolution or something suggesting 5% or so of penetration. We certainly believe at some point, when you reach a certain level of saturation, if you will, perhaps net metering was coming at a cost to other ratepayers. Certainly states like California and others have re-examined net metering, but you're talking about states and even certain localities with penetration of rooftop solar at 10, 15, 20% in certain areas. Where was Indiana at when we got rid of net metering? Somewhere around 0.2 of 1% penetration of net metering in the state of Indiana, less than 1,000 systems. Even the utilities, in testimony before legislators during discussions about getting rid of net metering, admitted that there was currently no subsidy in Indiana because of net metering, because of the low penetration. So I understand the question and certainly agree that when you reach certain levels of saturation, that may be coming at a cost to other ratepayers that don't have the privilege, if you will, of having solar systems on their home or their business. But the reality is Indiana was not even close to that level. We set a threshold with the initial net metering at 1.5% of utilities peak load as sort of a level, if you will, that once we hit this level, we need to talk about it again. And we were nowhere near that level when they got rid of it. It wasn't a conversation at all. So I certainly understand the question. CAC maintains our position that we must invest and improve policies around distributed resources, not only because of climate change, emissions, and the environmental imperative that we feel around that, but also because of costs and affordability issues, not only bringing savings to people that own those systems, but bringing savings to everybody by having more generation out there not owned by the utilities. Putting energy onto the grid is good for other ratepayers. But we do agree that at some point, the mechanism that was net metering may come at a cost. But the reality is, when Indiana got rid of it, we were nowhere near that threshold. And it was an absolute abomination that the state of Indiana removed that incentive years, if not decades, before Indiana was going to get to that point.
Ooh, well said, Kerwin. We will dive into another question. And Kerwin, I'll kick it to you again. What can we, the people, do to counter the lobbyists that are plaguing our state? How can folks help us with the work that we do?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably obvious. You already answered some of it, but certainly supporting Citizens Action Coalition and other nonprofits that are doing work at the State House, doing work at agencies, whether it's CAC at the IURC or other groups at other state agencies doing the work. But the importance of supporting nonprofits doing the work on the ground at the state capitol is absolutely imperative, because we need the special interest, especially the utilities and the energy companies, have so many boots on the ground down at the State House. I remember former State Senator Mike Delph telling me once that, Kerwin, I could have breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a movie with a lobbyist 365 days a year if I wanted to. He was somebody who did not take meals or gifts or things from lobbyists. So they are present everywhere. They are at the State House. They are in city county buildings. They are all over the place, whining and dining everybody. So support the nonprofits doing the work, participate in the process, send comments in on legislation, in on rate cases, talk to your elected officials, share your frustrations, share your stories, share your struggles, get involved in the system. Don't forget to vote. I could go on, but support the folks, the associations, the groups that are doing work on the ground on behalf of the people. There's a lot of us out there, and we quite frankly need your support, not just Citizens Action Coalitions, but other folks that are on the ground at the State House and in other agencies doing the work. When you have an extra $5, $10, I can't tell you how far that money goes for organizations fighting the good fight on behalf of the public.
Thank you very much, Kerwin. Ben, I'm gonna kick one to you. And this is about data center cost allocation. So as large electricity users come online, how will regulators ensure that the infrastructure built to serve them is not unintentionally shifted onto residential customers? Or how could they, rather?
That's a really great question, very timely. There's, I think, a number of things that we can do to make sure these costs aren't being shifted. So one is looking at the incremental cost of transmission to connect the data centers to the grid, making sure those incremental costs are directly paid by the data center customers and aren't being socialized and spread out across other ratepayers. We can look at the network upgrades, the transmission system upgrades that a utility might need to make to keep reliability on the system once a data center comes on. Make sure those upgrades to the entire system are also paid for by the data center. We want to make sure they're paying their fair share to contribute also to the existing system. And this is again getting kind of in the wonky details, but in these cases, we need very clear accounting, very clear information about the costs and the additional burden that they're putting on to the grid. On the generation side, I mentioned before, NIPSCO has created a pathway to kind of protect customers from the generating costs, the new power plants that NIPSCO is going to build by creating the separate company and making sure those costs aren't going to flow through to customers on rates. And in rate cases and other proceedings, you have folks like the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor and other interveners and stakeholders that come into the case that hire expert accountants, expert witnesses to scrutinize the books of utilities, to ask them hard-hitting questions in discovery where they're legally required to answer your questions and back up the information they provide in these cases. So there's a pretty robust process to check the math, to look under the hood, to make sure no funny business is happening, if you will, and to make sure that these costs are being appropriately allocated to the data centers and not ending up in your bill. Did that answer the question, Kelly? Oh, you're still on mute.
That was fabulous, Ben. Thank you. Very, very good. Okay, Kerwin, we're going to kick it back to you. And I think we're winding down to the end of our time answering questions. So for those of you that have asked questions that we have not had a chance to respond to, again, please keep your eyes peeled on your email because we'll reach out as soon as we can with answers for you. We've got a question about what does it mean by securitizing the remaining balance?
Yeah, well, as Ben talked about, part of the challenge, especially with NIPSCO bills right now, is ratepayers continue to pay for the old while they're paying for new. Securitization is the idea of taking the remaining debt, if you will, the remaining money owed on a power plant, and rather than leaving it in the customer's rate base, where customers are generally, paying those costs with the additional 10% or so added ROE on top of it, taking that debt and packaging that into a highly rated securitized bond at a much lower interest rate that is very attractive to investors and bond buyers, if you will, because it's guaranteed by the full faith and credit of utility ratepayers, if you will. But rather than ratepayers paying that within utilities depreciation in their rate base with that 10% or so rate of return on it, it then goes into the marketplace, a long-term, low-interest bond, where ratepayers are then paying back a longer-term bond at a 3, 4 or so percent interest rate, rather than through a compressed timeline on your utility bill at a higher rate of return. So it's just dealing with that debt that's sitting on a utilities book that ratepayers are getting hammered paying that debt. You can package that in a more attractive way. It's just a creative financing mechanism, way to create a an attractive financial product, if you will, that investors are interested in buying, and taking some of the load off the back of ratepayers and making that into a refinancing, if you will, at a much lower cost to ratepayers, and helping to bring down bills. And again, that is something the General Assembly has just sort of refused to address. There was a standalone securitization bill that CenterPoint used to securitize the remaining balance on their Brown plant down close to Evansville. They got a specific bill passed, but that legislation was only and exclusively for only CenterPoint and only that power plant, rather than making that mechanism, if you will, available for all utilities to use. But a lot of utilities don't want to use it. Why? They want to make that profit. They want to, and the General Assembly is happy, has been to this point anyway, happy to allow them to do that. So when we say there are things the legislature can do, there are things the commission can do, there's an example of securitization. However, that would require legislative action, legislative authorization. They did it once at a very limited scope, if you will, to only that one power plant for that one utility, but they could do that for everybody, and that would help reduce the burden that customers are realizing today on their utility bills.
Every bit helps. Absolutely. We need to be doing everything that we can to help folks right now. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us tonight for over an hour. We really appreciate you joining us. We really appreciate your wonderful questions. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. We'll hopefully see you on April 7th in Maryville if you can make it. But if not, remember March 24th is the investigative inquiry into energy affordability. So be sure to show up then. Thank you all so much. Take good care. We appreciate you.